This is Priyanka Rajneesh giving a third opposition speech on the motion. This House would require individuals to take a general political knowledge test in order to vote. The substantive arguments I anticipate are first on the proposition. Substantive 1, protecting democratic competence, where democracy only works if voters can make informed choices. Substantive 2, reducing manipulation and populism, where low information voters are especially vulnerable to misinformation campaigns and less likely to make accurately informed decisions. And substantive 3, democratic legitimacy through public trust, because a democracy loses legitimacy when the citizens believe the elections are decided by uninformed or manipulated voters. The opposition subs are: voting is a fundamental right, not a privilege. Substantive 2, knowledge tests will inevitably be biased and abused. Substantive 3, lived experience is equal to political knowledge. In other words, every citizen deserves to vote because they are all stakeholders in what the government's future actions are. At the point at which side proposition sacrifices democracy for different voter outcomes, they should lose your ballot. So proud to oppose. Now, a quick roadmap of my speech at the very top. First, I'd like to address framing, then move on to the 3 key questions of clash to show you why your ballot falls so clearly to side opposition. Now on to framing. From the very beginning of today's debate, side proposition has tried to frame the debate as whether informed voters make for better democracies or not. We think this is a fundamental mischaracterization of the motion's full extent. We agree, informed citizens are extremely valuable, but the motion isn't asking if more knowledge is good. The motion is asking, should the state condition the right to vote on a simple knowledge test? Think back to the burdens we presented at the very beginning of today's debate. Under side proposition's own burden, it's not enough for them to just list the benefits of a knowledge test. They must also defend the harms we bring and show why their advantages will always outweigh. In this speech, I will fulfill side opposition's burden and show why any benefits side proposition's world has will never justify the harms they cause. Now that framing's out of the way, the debate condenses very clearly into 3 points of clash. First, what gives democracy its legitimacy? Second, who should control access to political power? And lastly, whether side proposition has fully justified their mechanism. Now onto the first key point of clash. What gives democracy legitimacy? From their very first speaker, notice that side proposition has implicitly characterized democracy as democracy exists to maximize competent decisions. Their very first substantive talks about effective governance, where they give you this analysis that democracy can only work if voters make informed choices. They warranted that since governments control war, taxes, rights, the constitution, and the economy, it's crucial to ensure voters have a baseline of competence before they vote. Also, they can elect the best representation and understand who to vote for. But that's not the way we characterize democracy. We've carried this analysis down the bench from our very first substantive that voting is a fundamental right, that democracy exists to equally represent every citizen governed. The moment we exclude people who can't pass a government-designed test, it's not democracy and it sure isn't equal representation. Democracy gives every citizen a right to vote, not because they all have equal knowledge, but because every citizen has equal interests at stake. Side proposition has entirely failed to acknowledge that the government governs everyone, rich or poor, educated or uneducated. That's why democracy runs on everyone, regardless of their knowledge level, having a vote on who is elected into office. The moment we condition that fundamental right on a test, we destroy democracy. Now, side proposition's entire third substantive focuses on how democracy becomes more legitimate when people trust in the system. That's great, but they explain that democracy loses legitimacy when citizens believe that elections are mostly decided by misinformed voters. So, their logic is that when we pass this test, public trust will increase as more constituents see that voting is conditioned on whether you know enough about politics or not. But we think they misunderstood where legitimacy really comes from. Legitimacy is not people thinking elections are now trustworthy because the government has muted all the unknowledgeable in politics people. Legitimacy comes from every citizen having equal representation because voting rights is a constitutional right, not a privilege. Let's weigh the comparative. Even at their highest ground, even if a voter becomes more informed, this still destroys democracy by barring anyone who doesn't pass a test from their fundamental right. At their highest ground, even if public trust improves, it's at the cost of democracy. And we never thought a temporary solution should outweigh the very system that our country has used for centuries. Now, on to the second point of clash. Who should control access to political power? The entire proposition case is built on the assumption that the government will administer a fair test. They cite checkbacks, committees, and tell us that the test will just be general knowledge. However, the opposition operates on a fact. The government always has incentives to exploit the system. The logic is simple. When we put people in power, the very politicians in power, in charge of designing the test for the constituents who have the power to keep them in power or not, we create a massive conflict of interest. Now, the proposition's entire substantive 2 tells you that politicians rely on manipulation and exploitation of low information voters. So they basically can see that politicians aren't exactly the cleanest actors around. But if they aren't, then why are we giving them another measure to control our elections with a single test? Every institution must be designed assuming that future governments may act in their own political interests. Controlling qualification for voting is controlling the way we can shape the composition of our electorate. This is a major incentive for abuse. We gave you this analysis all the way back in our second substantive that political knowledge is already contested and heavily ideological. At very best, this test will be unintentionally biased. At the worst, the test is used to shape a desired demographic and a desired electorate to disenfranchise minority voters. This entirely dismantles side proposition's public trust argument, because when constituents decide that it's actually the government who has all the power to decide who votes and who doesn't, they lose all remaining trust in the government. We never thought that trading temporary trust for a stable system was a good idea. Now, on the last point, has the proposition accurately justified their mechanism? In other words, why this policy? Taking them at their very highest ground to begin with. Okay, let's say voters become more educated, they're less susceptible to misinformation, and public trust increases. Let's say all three do happen. This is entirely non-unique. Okay, even if citizens are more informed, it doesn't need to be that some citizens lose the right to vote to maintain integrity in our elections. The benefits that they bring come from a more educated electorate, not an electorate where we've weeded out the incompetent citizens. The proposition to have won your ballot must have explained from the very top of their case why the more restrictive mechanism is preferable. You should always prefer the alternative that preserves the fundamental rights of the people over their option that side proposition brings, because ultimately, side proposition creates massive avenues to disenfranchise voters, to keep politicians in power, and gives them massive incentives to rig these tests in the first place so they can control who is eligible to vote and thus control the entire electorate pool. Side proposition has not given you any analysis on why their stance is so much better than a more neutral, more educating policy in terms of increasing voter legitimacy and increasing the benefits of our democracy. Because the government shouldn't determine whose voice counts, because we shouldn't hand more power to the very politicians who are already rolling it. That's why you're so proud to oppose.